There are two main ways to interpret Donald Trump's attack on the Syrian airfields. Both have validity, but neither are without fault. The main way that you can interpret this is that he has made a catastrophic mistake in trying to involve the United States there once again. He actually campaigned against this, so it surprised me when he was this quick to engage in action. Nothing good has ever come from U.S. involvement in the Middle East, and I don't expect anything good will come from it in the future. Meddling in the region has only created more chaos, more violence, more instability, but more importantly has created opportunities for the fringe groups of Islam to gain power and influence in the area. You have to understand that these radical groups, they thrive on chaos. They want conflict in the area because it gives them a bigger opportunity to gain all that power and influence that they so desire. The longer conflict goes on, the more opportunities that they have to establish themselves as an authority in the region. This is exactly what happened in Iraq. This is exactly what led to ISIS. If you think back to 2003 and the aftermath of the Second Iraq War, you saw that the government was trying to decide what to do to replace the former Saddam regime. In their stupidity, they decided that the best thing to do was to bar anybody that was associated with Saddam Hussein's political party from ever holding a government position in the future. This is ridiculous because, of course, Saddam Hussein was a dictator, so membership into that political party was almost compulsory. What happens then is that a majority of the country, many people who were moderates, many people who had government experience in leadership, and had some valid opinions as to the future of Iraq, they were not able to come to the table and discuss this transition period. All members of the Ba'ath Party had to remain silent. Meanwhile, members of more radical, more fringe groups were able to have a loud voice into what the future of Iraq was going to look like. In specific, Shia Muslims had significant say in these things, which only instigated Shia versus Sunni violence. And ultimately, this is where ISIS was able to arise from. They pitted these two groups against each other. It didn't matter to them. As long as people were dying, as long as there was conflict, as long as there was blood, they were able to have more authority in the region. They were able to spread their sphere of influence. Now, I don't want to turn this into a historical discussion, but it is important to gain the context to see that all of our previous involvements in the area have led to nothing good, so why get involved again? Why repeat the mistakes of the past? However, I think the most important question here is there even any justification to consider such an attack to begin with? Apparently, it was Assad that used these chemical weapons on civilians, and of course it's a horrendous act, but there's no evidence that he was the one that actually did it. It makes no sense. So unless Donald Trump has some highly classified information that he's not willing to share with the American public, why would you be so hasty as to jump to conclusions? Think back to a similar situation that occurred in 2013 when the Obama administration was almost lured to military action in Syria. This was over, again, the alleged attacks that Assad had used chemical weapons upon the civilians of Ghouta, which made no sense then, and it makes even less sense now. As more evidence has come out, it turns out that Assad had very little, if anything at all, to do with this to begin with. A more likely scenario is that rebels had gotten their hands on these chemical weapons and used them. Now, the reason is irrelevant, whether they used it for pure barbarism, whether they used it to create more conflict, or to draw out the West into the area. It makes no sense. The point is that Assad had nothing to do with it. Yet, the United States was almost compelled to act in a military sense. Thankfully, the Russians stepped in and was able to broker a deal in which Assad agreed to dispose of all his chemical weapons, to turn them over to the Chemical Weapons Convention for destruction, such that in June of 2014, every last bit of his chemical stockpile was destroyed, at least the ones that he reported. So if you go by that narrative, he doesn't even have any chemical weapons to be using to begin with. So in the recent events, a more likely scenario is that once again, rebels have exploited the opportunity to draw out the West or to create conflict in the region. The most important question to always ask when investigating an event is who benefits. Assad has almost nothing to benefit from doing this, whereas rebels have everything to gain. Assad, with the aid of Russia, has been making significant gains in Syria. He has pushed back the rebels. He has almost destroyed ISIS. So what reason then does he have to gas random civilians? He has no reason to do this at all. However, what benefit do the rebels gain from doing this? Exactly what is happening now. The West is becoming involved. Assad is in much bigger trouble than he was before, and they may be able to exploit the situation to take back some of the losses that had been incurred on them within the past several months. Why should we trust the government in anything they say when the story is completely illogical, they provide no evidence for it, and they have a history of using this war propaganda to get us involved in the Middle East? They especially love to use the imagery of suffering children to get the American public behind a war effort. Think in the 1990s when this woman got before Congress and was talking about the Iraqi army just ripping babies out of incubators and killing children and babies. Of course, the whole thing was a complete lie and fabrication, but it did not stop the Congress. It did not stop members of Senate. It did not stop the president, George Bush at the time, of repeating this story and using it as a reason for the Gulf War, or the lies of weapon of mass destruction for the second Iraq War. Where were these weapons of mass destruction? Where was the mass carnage? Where was all the suffering? I don't see it. We still don't see it. There was no evidence for it. It is all war propaganda. All these images you see of people choking on their own secretions, of children dying and convulsing, this is propaganda, and it is powerful propaganda at that. That is some very powerful imagery, but it does not mean that we need to get involved. Now humor me this, say that it was Assad himself that did this and ordered these attacks. What difference does it make? We can't play whack-a-mole with every evil action that occurs throughout the world. There are more horrendous things happening in Africa, in remote parts of Central Asia, in other places of the world, but nobody talks about those. Nobody publicizes it in the media. The only reason why you're seeing this is because it is a war effort. It is war propaganda to get the American public more opportunistic about getting involved in the Middle East again, but we should not be doing that. What you need to understand about Syria is that there are only two options there. You either have the Assad regime or you have rebels. There's no other option. The idea that we can install some government that is going to be friendly towards the United States and the West is pure fantasy. If Assad is deposed, there will be instability, and like I talked about earlier, radical groups thrive on instability. The longer the conflict goes on, the longer people try to decide who should take power, the more influence that these radical groups gain. There is no alternative. Remember also that multiple members on the Council of Foreign Relations are advisors to Donald Trump. These are all globalists. These are all warmongers. These are all people that have been pushing for further intervention in the Middle East. So that is gravely concerning as well. Now, there is a second way to interpret these events, one that is much more optimistic. You could view this as a brilliant geopolitical move by Donald Trump to flex his muscles to the world, to show his competitors and opponents and critics, both domestic and foreign, that he is a serious player in the game of geopolitics. Think about this. With this airstrike in Syria, he shows multiple things. He accomplishes multiple goals. Number one, he demonstrates a willingness to act and become involved in foreign affairs. He did run on a non-intervention policy for the most part, so many people thought they might be able to take advantage of the United States in the foreign aspect of global politics. But by doing this, he shows that he is still an active participant and that the United States is the main determinant of global influence. There is some evidence that this is in fact what Donald Trump is doing, mainly in the fact that the airstrike itself accomplished very little in a logistical sense. Okay, it blew up some hangars, it maybe put a couple of potholes in the runway, but it didn't really accomplish much. It didn't really destroy any munitions depot, it didn't really cripple the Syrian army to any degree. So it may be that this is just muscle flexing. What else would this accomplish? It accomplishes a sense that the United States has become unpredictable. Think about how quick this all occurred. Within days of the alleged gas attack, Donald Trump responded with brute force, something that nobody was expecting. So it makes his opponents much more wary and much more cautious of engaging the United States in the global sphere. You'll also notice that Trump has received widely positive reviews of his attack on this airfield, both from the international community and from people here in the United States. All the warhawks are happy about this. John freaking McCain, Lindsey Graham, Hillary Clinton of all people, all these people are praising Donald Trump and his actions, so it kind of calms the storm for him here at home as well. Many people were not taking him seriously. They were saying that he is not up for global competition, and that has silenced some of the critics. So that is another thing that this airstrike has accomplished for Donald Trump. It has improved his credibility within the international and domestic sphere. Another important consequence of this is that it dismisses the falsehood that Donald Trump is an agent of Russian puppetry. By striking the Assad regime directly, he is indirectly challenging Vladimir Putin. In essence, the United States and the Russian governments are fighting a proxy war in Syria, and Donald Trump has just stepped up the game. Who is going to believe the media lies that Donald Trump is a Kremlin spy and is only president because Vladimir Putin hacked our elections? That story has very little credibility, as I've talked about at length in a previous video, but even less so now. Also, who was with Donald Trump at Mar-a-Lago when these attacks occurred? It was the Chinese president Xi Jinping. What sort of message does that send to the Chinese? What is Donald Trump communicating when he's flexing his muscles when Xi Jinping is sleeping under his very own roof? What sort of leverage does he gain in negotiating based on those strikes? Along that same line, Donald Trump is sending a very strong warning to Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Days earlier, he talked publicly about taking unilateral action against a dictator if the Chinese were not willing to help, and nobody took him seriously. It was a joke statement. That is until now. Now everybody is paying attention, especially as he maneuvers more naval capabilities to eastern China. I can guarantee you that Kim Jong-un is probably shitting his pants right now. I'm going to do a much more in-depth video on North Korea, but it seems like the storm clouds are definitely gathering over the peninsula. When Donald Trump says that he is willing to take unilateral action against North Korea, I don't necessarily take him seriously even now, but the point is that by saying that, and then by backing it up with the strike in Syria, the Chinese are much more likely to cooperate with Donald Trump to bring about regime change or some other form of action on the North Koreans. So to recap, if you want to interpret these airstrikes as a geopolitical move, it accomplishes multiple things, multiple brilliant things. It establishes Donald Trump's willingness to become involved in foreign affairs. It gives him an aura of unpredictability that confuses his enemies. It dismisses the falsehood that he is working with the Russians. It expresses tremendous strength to the Chinese. It sends a message to North Korea, and it harnesses international and domestic support. He has accomplished a lot from a geopolitical standpoint with a simple airstrike that was logistically irrelevant. Here's the problem though, he has drawn a very thick red line. So if you want to interpret it in this way, what happens when there's another gas attack? He'll have to act. What message have the rebels been sent? They've been sent the message that, hey, if there's another gas attack that we can blame on Assad, the United States is very likely to get involved in a much more capable military sense. So we have a problem here. We have granted the rebels in the region a very alluring reason to stage a chemical gas attack. Now, whether they staged this one or not is irrelevant because they now have every reason to stage the next one. And of even more consequence, while the first airstrike by Donald Trump was an indirect challenge to Vladimir Putin, the next one is going to be a direct challenge to him. Even more reason for the rebels to create chaos by staging a gas attack. So it is my hope that Donald Trump's intention is not to oust the Assad regime, but to flex his muscles geopolitically. I think it's too early to conclusively say whether Donald Trump has made a tremendous mistake or whether he was flexing his geopolitical muscles. We will see what he does over the next several weeks, and that will determine for which reason he actually bombed the airfields. I certainly hope that it was the latter reason, but I cannot preclude the previous one